Thin, that's me.
You're
Pre-COVID, a little bit thicker now. Thin, yeah, I'm
thin
thin
and
maybe
thick.
on the bass.
Thin and thick, like, it sounds a little bit thin.
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe on the bass. Usually that's where I'm thinking when people talk about that. Like thin would be light on the bass, mid bass. Thick would be maybe too much or very boomy and resonant.
And how about with two C's instead of a K? Or three C's?
Ooh, that's very, very boomy and very, very resonant.
Or bloated. It could be bloated or boomy. You already got all these.
I think they're all the same, basically. They could be. When I think of boomy, I think of more like a specific frequency. Like 50 hertz is very boomy. When I think of thick, I think of like the whole bass is just kind of,
Or how about when you start getting some room modes and it's really enhancing that bass? I think people kind of refer to it as boomy or bloated, or there's too much of it.
Yeah.
This one was brought up in one of our daily hi-fi after shows, Transients. I had to go and look it up to make sure I was saying it correctly. Or
not transients.
So what? This I guess is like the attack, right? Like how fast it responds, like quick
attack and decay. Yeah, that's what I think of.
Rolloff.
Like high frequency roll off. So if you've got a pretty flat on axis response, and then all of a sudden at like 4 kilohertz, the high frequency just starts to roll off, or the bass, might start to roll off at 80 hertz, and you need a subwoofer, something like that.
Right, and so there's natural roll off, and then there's roll off that you might induce.
Right.
Okay, so mids, highs, lows.
Well, REW might be better, but for me, lows would be, subwoofer to mid bass region. So maybe like 5 hertz, if you want to talk about low lows, to about 300 hertz. That'd be like the upper mid bass region. And then the lower mid range to, so let's say 300 to 2K for the mids, and then 2K plus for the highs.
Okay.
And then you got some, 2 to 4 is kind of an area of upper mid, lower treble, I guess.
All right. And so we probably should have hit this earlier. What's frequency response?
Frequency response is just, measuring a speaker's performance, and there could be various axes. We talked about off axis earlier, but let's pretend like you're just talking about on axis right now. So the frequency response would be, what that speaker is doing on axis at 0 degrees. So maybe like a flat line ruler type response is going to be a more neutral response. And then if it's got a high frequency roll off, it's going to have like a tilt, a certain high frequency region. I don't know. That one to me is almost so easy that it's hard to explain.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah. So what is it? What's the technical term? Kind of like the amplitude over
by frequency. Yeah.
Over frequency, right?
Yeah.
All right. So amp, I think I meant amplifier, not ampere.
Yeah, that's good. An amplifier provides signal gain. So signal coming in, and you want to boost it to give your speakers some more power and provide additional output. I think maybe it's the easiest way to put it.
All right. Now, so ohms.
Ohms, that's just a resistance.
measure of resistance, right?
Yeah, right.
All right. So we're all over the place. We're going advanced, simple, or basic, and then you can go, what's BBC dip?
That's that 2 to 4K dip, right? And there's a history there. I think you probably know it better than I do.
Yeah, I guess when they were making those LS35As and some of those speakers, they decided that it sounded better with a dip in that frequency response, but that is debatable because it could be a limitation in their drivers, and that has to do with their crossover point.
Yeah, that's a good one. So crossover is just, let's say you've got a mid-range and a tweeter, and you want to have the mid-range play up as high as you can without it sounding bad, and you want the tweeter to play as low as it can without sounding bad. You put a crossover on it, and then you bring those two speakers together, and you try to basically make one point source speaker. So you can't tell the difference between the mid and the tweeter handing off. It just sounds like one speaker.
All right. Chuffing.
Chuffing, usually, for me, that's ports. So if you got a lot of air velocity going through those ports, you get a lot of, I'm not going to try to mimic chuffing, but it's not a good thing. Everybody knows.
It's turbulence. It's basically turbulence in the port, which you can actually calculate pretty easily. So Sibilance. I know how to spell that, see?
Yeah, see? Boom. That's 5 decay. That's like the S's, that sound.
All right.
A lot of people really hate that.
5K.
5 to 7K usually. I mean, it could be 8. I don't know exactly what the definition is, but it's usually that 5 to 7K region.
Okay. Compressed. What does that mean when something sounds compressed?
Compressed is when you're trying to provide more output than the system can actually handle thermally, then it starts to limit the output. So let's say you tell the system through your AVR to increase volume by 3 dB, but it only increases by 1 dB because it can't dissipate the heat quickly enough. So that is compression. Another term for compressed, though, could be just talking about the music itself, so you could have compression in the media itself. So a song could be compressed. It might not have a lot of dynamic range, which means that when you have like a snare hit, it might need to peak at plus 12 dB, but the way it was mastered, it only peaks at plus 6 dB, something like that.
So dynamic range compression, and the other one's like thermal compression.
Yeah. And you can also have amplitude compression, but to be honest, I don't recall the difference between thermal and amplitude compression. So we'll pretend like I didn't say that.
All right. What is smooth? I hear you talk a lot about, smooth off-axis response. What does that mean?
Yeah. Well, smooth is Rob Thomas.
Oh, yes.
And Carlos
yes.
Santana. Yeah. All right. Smooth would just be a flat line would be ideally like the ideal definition of smooth, and anything that you have other than a flat line could be not smooth. But generally, you're giving leeway to frequency or to speakers because speakers are never really flat. There's always something to them. So let's say that you have a peaking in the high frequency range, so in the treble. Let's say you intentionally put it there via EQ. You don't want just to put a big sharp peak at 7 kilohertz. Maybe you want to make a smooth transition from 1 kilohertz to 7 kilohertz or something like that.
So the opposite would be kind of like a step.
Yes,
Right.
absolutely. Yeah. Curvature.
All right. So high-end hi-fi. What would you consider high-end hi-fi?
Oh man, I don't know. I mean, what I would consider high-end hi-fi. That's a tough one, man. I'm gonna let you answer that one.
Yeah. So I've seen, there's trade shows that are called like high-end, right? And to me, high-end just means it's almost to the point where it's just expensive. Like the fact that it's expensive and exclusive is its own thing. It's not so much, of course they're saying that it sounds better, but it's almost not the main focus if it's high end.
Maybe like a status.
Yeah, like watches, You go to those watch trade shows, they don't call it a watch trade show. They call it whatever that thing is called. Somebody can tell me.
I don't know what they call them. I don't wear a watch anymore.
It's not called a watch trade show though.
All right.
Directivity. Please enlighten me.
All right. So directivity, let's say that you're playing a speaker and on the low frequency. So most speakers are this way, generically speaking. Most speakers, low frequency, they're omnidirectional, which means they have a 360-degree pattern going around the speaker. And as you go higher in frequency, they become more directional, which means that the speakers, instead of having 360-degree, they may slowly start to taper to firing only directly in front of the speaker at like the highest of frequencies. And that's just what directivity is just a transition from, wide to narrow. But there are certainly speakers that they're not always wide. So maybe in the bass, for instance, the Dutch and Dutch 8C that I have behind me is a different type of design. We're at 100 hertz. It is directional. So it's mostly forward firing and nothing is firing behind the speaker from the mid-range 100 hertz and up. So it's all, if you look at it from a bird's eye view, you would just see the speaker pattern just playing forward, and it's a trip. So that's kind of what directivity means. And then you get into the more minute details of, as you transition from a woofer to a tweeter, the woofer starts to beam because as it gets higher in frequency relative to the size of the speaker itself, of the woofer itself, your wavelength will get long. And your wavelength will also start to get to the point where it maxes the size of that woofer, and then the wavelength or the speaker radiation pattern begins to narrow up. So it starts off wide and then it becomes more focused inward. And the problem that you get is then you match it up to a tweeter. The tweeter on the low end, because the wavelength is so low relative to its itty bitty size, that it begins not omnidirectional. I'm tripping over words here.
Yeah.
But then it starts to transition to narrow. So the problem, going back to it, is you start with a woofer and you're wide and then you're narrow, but then you introduce a tweeter and then you go wide again and then you narrow again. That's not ideal. Ideally, you want a same radiation pattern where it's transitioning throughout. You don't have a big step in the transition as you hand off from one. Right, exactly. As you hand off from one driver to another, you want it to be smooth. Yes.
I always relate a lot of the sound stuff to light. And so with flashlights,
Yeah.
you have flashlights that can be what they call throwers, where it just throws really far, but the beam is kind of narrow. And then
Right.
they have
More
some that are
focused.
called floods, where it's just like meant to just be real wide of a pattern.